Welcome to Module 3, the moderation process. In the previous module, the setting of assessments was discussed in detail. In this session, we will look at the important role of the moderator. This is a generic discussion and is applicable to Report 191 semester and trimester programs, as well as to NCV programs. Reference will be made continuously to the latest Report 191 ICAS guidelines and the latest NCV ICAS guidelines, and it is therefore imperative that you have your specific guideline with you during the workshop. This module deals with the moderation of question papers and will be discussed in 2 sessions. Session 1, Pre-Moderation. The importance of internal moderation of the ICAS. ICAS marks for Report 191 and NCV programs. The moderation process, including pre-moderation with brief reference to the assessment criteria. Session 2, Post-Moderation. The recording of marks. The post-assessment moderation checklist. The completion of a composite pre- and post-moderation report. The role of the Department of Higher Education and Training. Session 1, Pre-Moderation. Why is it so important that the ICAS is moderated? It is because assessments should be fair, valid, and reliable. Moderation should ensure assessments are of an acceptable standard, are unambiguous, and of such a nature that the student can complete them in a specific time. Moderation of the marking process is important to ensure fairness towards the candidate, to ensure consistency in marking, and to establish reliability of examination instructions as laid down in the ICAS guidelines. Lecturers, you have this all in your hands. Please do proper moderation. ICAS marks for Report 191 and NCV programs have already been discussed in detail in Module 2. You must comply with the ICAS guidelines for your specific program. Remember that a distinction is made between Report 191 semester and trimester programs and NCV qualifications, subdivided into fundamental and vocational subjects. Pre-assessment moderation process and checklist. What does the moderation process consist of? Let's first test what you know. Complete activity in your workbook. Compare your answers with the theory in your handout. Please note that moderation is a critical part of the setting process, and therefore a thorough evaluation of the ICAS should take place. Also bear in mind that assessment set should be in line with the standard set in the external examination papers. Moderation of ICAS tasks takes place in 2 phases. Firstly, pre-assessment moderation, the evaluation of the task before it is administered in the classroom. This is conducted by the subject moderator. Secondly, post-assessment moderation, the evaluation of the quality of the assessment process and marking undertaken by the lecturer. This is conducted by the subject moderator. Some of you are lecturing the Report 191 programs, while others are lecturing the NCV programs. You need to refer to your relevant ICAS guidelines. Report 191 programs should refer to Annexure A of ICAS guidelines for Report 191 programs. NCV programs should refer to Annexure H of ICAS guidelines for the NCV programs. These documents are generic and thus the same for both programs and will therefore be dealt with as such. Do you remember the expression, failing to plan results in planning to fail? This is exactly the case with the implementation of the moderation process. You need to plan the whole process. The examiner moderator for each task should be indicated on the assessment plan, which should be in place in January of each new year before classes commence. Examiners and moderators should be subject experts. This is extremely important. Although all lecturers can moderate basic elements, like correctness of marks, correctness of front page and language, not all lecturers are familiar with the content of all subjects. Let us have a brief look at the pre-assessment moderation process and checklist. You must refer to the Report 191 ICAS Guidelines templates, Annexure G2, and the NCV ICAS Guidelines templates, Annexure H. The process can be summarized as follows. You will notice that there are 3 columns. The first column states what process must be carried out. The second column denotes who has the responsibility for carrying out the process. The last column tells you when the process must be carried out. We can see that before classes commence, the HOD or senior lecturer must appoint specific examiners and moderators. Add internal college due dates to manage timelines. Manage the due dates. Throughout the academic period, as indicated on the internal assessment plan, the subject moderator must moderate assessments, tasks, and tools by checking that the examiner completed the examiner's list, verifying that all components on the checklist, the various criteria, are correct, giving feedback regarding changes that need to be made and making recommendations on the checklist, keeping all evidence of the moderation process. After receiving the assessment task and tool, the subject moderator must give feedback to the examiner. The subject examiner must then implement any changes recommended by the moderator. Only then will the subject moderator give final approval of the assessment instrument. When you do pre-moderation, you must take into account exactly the same criteria that had been used by the assessor to determine whether an assessment and the assessment tool is on standard. This has been discussed in detail in Module 2, and therefore only a few aspects will be highlighted. I'm sure you still remember the criteria. Criterion 1 is the analysis grid. Criterion 2 is the technical criteria. Criterion 3 is the content coverage. Criterion 4 are the cognitive skills. Criterion 5 are the types of questions to be asked. Criterion 6 is the language and bias. Criterion 7 is the overall impression. Criterion 8 is the assessment tool. Remember, when you look at these same criteria now, you must do so with a critical eye, as you have to take the ultimate responsibility for this paper. Criterion 1, Analysis of Task. Do not neglect this. Do the analysis grid yourself and then compare it with that of the examiner. Remember that completing this analysis grid correctly will ensure the correctness of many other aspects, such as addressing the various cognitive levels, correct time allocation, the correct standard, adherence to the syllabus or SAGs, adherence to the weighted values of modules or topics. This brings us to Criterion 2, the technical criteria. How would you feel about a paper that you can clearly see had been cut and pasted? Different fonts, wrong numbering, wrong date on the front page. This is unfortunately exactly what happens, but even worse, sometimes the moderator ticks all the criteria as yes, meaning everything is correct. The neatness of papers plays a very important role in education. Papers should be correctly numbered, mark allocations should be very clearly indicated, illustrations, where applicable, must be of a good quality, and instructions to students should be clear and specific. Refer back to the DHET document, a quick guide to the typing and editing of question papers and marking guidelines. Please make use of this document to ensure a standardized layout of papers. Lack of evidence is always a problem, especially where practical work has been done. Check the criterion on evidence to ensure that you will not be confronted with lack of evidence when you do post moderation. Again, remember the following do's and don'ts. Make sure that questions are correctly numbered. Ensure correct mark allocations. Make sure that illustrations are of a good quality. Make sure that instructions to candidates are correct and clear. Do not tick the technical criteria as being correct if you have not checked it. Do not make a ticked master copy and then just change the date every time. Do not cut and paste from previous papers, resulting in different fonts and wrong numbering. This brings us to Criterion 3, Content Coverage. Do you think this section can be moderated if there is no analysis grid? Definitely not. Thorough moderation of Criterion 3 ensures adherence to the syllabus or SAGs with regard to both content and weighted values per topic or module. You should remember that content is not limited to a specific textbook, but to the relevant subject syllabus or SAGs. Although some syllabi are outdated, you should try to incorporate relevant and up-to-date developments in your respective subjects. You should also evaluate the creativeness of a paper. Topics should be integrated and not asked in isolation. Criterion 4 deals with the coverage of the different cognitive levels. This component cannot be moderated if you have no knowledge of Bloom's taxonomy. You have already watched a video on Bloom's taxonomy and should be familiar with the different cognitive levels. By now, it should be clear that there is a strong correlation between mark allocation, the level of difficulty, and time allocation. Do you remember the example shown on this slide, based on the subject entrepreneurship and business management? Notice how the different cognitive levels are awarded different amounts of marks. For basic level of difficulty or conceptual knowledge, list any 4 factors that a service business needs to take into consideration on deciding where to establish a business. The marks would be 4 times 1, totaling 4. For a middle level of difficulty or comprehension and application, discuss any 4 factors that the owner of a creche has to take into consideration on deciding where to establish the business. The marks would be 4 times 2, totaling 8. For high level of difficulty, or analysis and problem solving, a case study on a creche is given. The business is not successful. Various problems are stated, including the wrong choice as to where the business should have been established, as well as other problems. The candidate has to analyze or discuss why the business is a failure and needs to come with suggestions of how these problems can be addressed. The candidate also has to present the answer in a particular way for 4 times 3 marks, or 12 in total. Criterion 5 deals with a different type of questions asked. You should make sure that mark allocations are correct and in line with the cognitive demand. For example, a name or list type of question should only count 1 mark each. When moderating a paper, please take note of the following. Refrain from using verbs such as mention, identify, elaborate if it is not applicable. Explain is not the same as list or state. Explain is similar to giving a definition. A definition tells what an item or concept is and not how it is used or its purpose. Definitions are to be allocated 2 or more marks. Items that are listed should be allocated only 1 mark each. Indicate clearly the number of responses required by a question in the mark allocation on both the question paper and the marking guideline. For example, 3 times 2 indicates 3 responses worth 2 marks each. Alternatively, indicate the number of responses in capital letters. For example, state 3 rules. Avoid asking multiple questions within a question. For example, name, explain, and give 2 examples of 3 types of crime, 15 marks. This should rather be split as shown here. We already dealt in detail with Criterion 6 on language and bias when we discussed assessments. Moderators, please keep the following in mind. Language should be kept simple and subject-related. Please take special note of the content and quality when you moderate case studies, passages, or scenarios. Refer back to Module 2 on assessments for possible pitfalls when you moderate case studies. By now, you will have realized that moderation is a whole process and not just a tick-off routine. We are now nearing the end of the pre-moderation process. Criterion 7 deals with the overall impression. You now have to talk about the paper you are setting based on what you found in Criterion 1 to 6. With reference to the appropriate standard, you need to keep in mind that the standard of internal assessments should be in line with external papers written by the candidates. ICAS marks can easily become inflated if internal assessments are too easy. The opposite is, however, also true. If internal assessments are too difficult, it may result in a candidate not obtaining a valid ICAS mark, unnecessarily prohibiting him or her from writing a final examination. Last, but definitely not least, is Criterion 8, the assessment tool. You know how frustrating it is to mark a paper if the memorandum does not correspond with the paper, whether it is the numbering system that is wrong, an incomplete memorandum, or even a totally wrong memorandum. A few points to remember. The assessment tool should be thoroughly moderated, as this will be used by various lecturers to assess the work of the candidates. All aspects, such as the numbering system and the mark allocations, should correspond with the assessment. It is recommended that you work out the paper first before moderating the assessment tool. This will ensure thorough moderation. It is not necessary to indicate a tick in the case where the question states list, name, state, as it is clear from the mark allocation that, for example, 5 times 1 means 1 mark each. Where the examiner wants marks to be allocated at specific places, it should be indicated with a tick to facilitate consistent marking. Do not neglect this section of the pre-moderation. You now have to take a decision either to approve, conditionally approve, or reject a paper or task. It is important to give qualitative feedback. If a paper is rejected, it means that most of the criteria were not met. You need to highlight the specific criteria that have not been met. You also need to motivate why you say so. Look carefully at the forms on this slide for an example of how to do this. When you approve a paper, it means that all the criteria have been met and that no further changes can be made. When a paper is conditionally approved, it means that you found some criteria that have not yet been met and that certain changes need to be made before it can be finally approved. All of the changes that need to be made should be listed. It is very important that you should evaluate the changes after they've been made and before final approval is given. You need to see the paper again before final sign-off. This brings us to the end of Session 1 of Module 3, in which we covered the importance of internal moderation of the ICAS, ICAS marks for Report 191 and NCV programs, the moderation process, including pre-moderation, with brief reference to the assessment criteria.